in the day-to-day, how are you using generative AI in your company? Because I assume that though GPT-4 vision might be on the horizon, it won't be doing sperm counts anytime soon.
Thank God.
Actually, vision's already here.
Is it? Yeah. Wow.
Well, yeah, so hi, I'm Lily Elsner, and I am, as you so kindly introduced, CEO and co-founder of Fertility. We're developing a postal sperm test. So people are able to collect a sample at home, no awkward situations you may have seen in films, and instead people are able to just pop a test into a priority post box and it's sent to us in Headington. We then analyze the sample and then are able to give results to individuals as well as recommendations. And on basically how to improve their fertility and their sperm health. But how we use Gen AI, like as of right now, what I'm going to go do later today, is we basically have been trying to test and learn, as some of the other panels have described, of just understanding what's commercially available, how we can possibly have different use cases. So one that we've explored, initially, obviously, as a tiny startup, very lean, we were like, great, oh my gosh, we never have to have a marketing company. Like we can just ask ChatGPT and its competitors. We never have to worry about content again. We'll just say, write an SEO optimized blog post, slap it up on the website, and we'll be good to go. That is not the case. We've had a lot of issues with hallucinations in a lot of cases where, especially where it basically tells us what we want to hear, which I find really interesting. So for example, we've been trying to, both on the external content side, people don't know a lot of us about sperm health. So we're trying to figure out ways to explain what's going on with people's bodies, have them understand. And basically when we ask the different models what to do or like how to explain this, sometimes it'll write something really beautiful and then we go check it and we're like, this is entirely false. This is referencing papers that don't exist and many of you have experienced this. So we've been very cautious about actually using it for content externally as well as internally. So we've been trying to play with the different models to basically see, are there instances where it could help us with interpreting results and saying to patients, you know, gosh, your sperm looks really bad. How do you empathetically say that, especially when you're not a human able to deliver those results and do it in an automated way? So different aspects of the customer journey, all the way from sort of awareness in terms of our marketing, all the way through the results delivery and thinking about the way that we run our business, trying to make it leaner. Again, we sort of thought initially when these models came out, oh gosh, this is going to be, you know, we really will just need the founding team and our embryologists to do the results, and we've got a startup like ready to be the sperm unicorn, but we are not quite at that level yet, and so that's really how we engage with it on a day-to-day basis.
And just building on that, Mandela, with the sort of so many startups and founders, I think, try and go, I don't need a marketing department, I can use AI to do this. And obviously your startup is in the marketing space. So do you sort of, are there some common problems that you think AI can solve for founders, but maybe it needs a bit more sort of fine tuning and a bespoke aspect where you can set that up for them and then build off the top of that?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Mandela Patrick, did my DPhil here at Oxford in AI. And so we had originally started actually building in the marketing space. And a lot of what we were trying to do is sort of fully generative ads. And so I think what's really powerful about with generative AI was that for the first time we were able to connect creative generation with creative analytics. And so you had like these really powerful optimization algorithms. But then for the first time you actually had algorithms that actually generate content and then sort of like close the full loop. So we actually started building in this space, and what we found is that in a similar sense in terms of like text where you have these hallucinations, similarly when you're trying to advertise someone's like product, it doesn't quite retain the same like level of detail and fidelity for someone's product. And so when you try to generate these ads, it just didn't look quite as good. And so what we found is generative AI is just not quite there yet for fully generative ads for images. Videos, you're pretty much maybe a year or two away. And so we ended up focusing on a totally different problem more recently in terms of how do we use generative AI for allowing people to express themselves online. That's a much easier problem because you're not trying to sort of like sell a product, you're trying to allow people to like have fun and be more entertained and like express themselves in all these different visual ways. And so I think depending on what your use case is and how accurate and how high fidelity you need the output, you might have to tackle different problems because generative AI is just not quite there yet.
Eito and Henry, I know your companies actually are like sort of for LLMs themselves, but yourselves, do you use ChatGPT on the daily for any day-to-day business tasks, or do you steer clear because you're just so
I think building on what Mandela said, there's places where generative AI is really impressive, but it's not all the way there yet. So I think how I see ourselves using it internally is very much like an assistant use case rather than like a replacement use case. So it's not, hey, go and write me SEO optimized blog post. It's, here's a blog post that I've written, go and improve it. What am I missing? What should I consider? And so it's very much that kind of co-pilot use case, which I think GitHub popularized for code generation. And that I think is where LLMs and generative AI right now really has the strongest product market fit. It's not that it can replace a capable human doing the task on their own, it's that it can assist that human to be 5 times more efficient.
Yeah, I think for us, the main use case of generative AI is one in sort of programming. We're a very sort of tech-centric cybersecurity firm, and so the use of like code generation is really amazing. We've actually started trying out this new IDE called Cursor, and it's absolutely incredible. I think it's better than GitHub Copilot in almost every single way. And just the productivity gains is so incredible. I mean, we were just sort of plotting out our hiring plans, and we were sort of saying, do we actually need 10 people, or can we just get 3 people who are like so unbelievably competent, and their productivity just goes 10x with these generative AI tools, where they can just go open up 3 screens, make 3 agents do something while you wait for one, you load it, and it's incredible. And I think it just really changes the game for programming and just productivity. I think other areas in which we're sort of using it is really for the cybersecurity aspects. I think, long context, LLM inference, so when you're putting in really long sentences wow, thematic choices. The AI is listening. Yeah, I think there's obviously issues with hallucinations and sort of short context lengths, which means it just doesn't have a long enough attention to attend to everything you said. Well, some of the ways in which we're sort of hacking through that is really exploring methods like AutoGPT, or more recently stuff like Voyager, which basically was some NVIDIA scientists hooked up GPT-4 to a Minecraft playing agent, and it was able to beat a lot of the previous state-of-the-art models when it comes to playing Minecraft, and it was able to mine a pickaxe, find diamonds, farm a pig, and all of this just using text as its internal consciousness. And the really remarkable thing is that you can see the consciousness, as in you can literally read what the agent is thinking. And I think these kind of agentic AI models are definitely here to stay, and they will only get better with better AI models and more multimodal models. I think there's something quite remarkable starting in generative AI, specifically within LLMs, where I think people are starting to realize that it's sort of a new operating system where it can take a lot of different types of data in and spit different types of data out. Andre Karpathy, who's one of the leading ML scientists, really said this as well, but where we're sort of generally going with these models is that we're going to have text to image models or image to text models. You're going to have video to text and all of this stuff. And so we're really going multimodal, and it's going to be this new operating system that can operate between all these different modalities and reason about them with the trained data sets. So I think those are sort of where we find the most amount of exciting opportunity.
That's really interesting. And I know they say practice your elevator pitch, but I don't know if they ever intended to have some music in the background to go with it. So sorry about those technical difficulties there, but I think it's all sorted now. But one thing that I hear quite often from potentially like VCs and other founders as well, is that's just a fancy wrapper on top of OpenAI, or where's your defensibility and where's your moat? So I think based on that, Henry, you probably work with a lot of companies that are implementing LLMs, and some of them might fit into this category of being accused of a fancy wrapper on top of a large language model. So time for your elevator pitch. What would you say is the first step for an AI company to actually differentiate themselves and have a moat and some defensibility, and not just be accused of being a fancy wrapper on top of OpenAI's API?
Yeah, well, it's something. So, as part of my company, we build a product analytics platform for large language model applications. So we work with hundreds of companies that are building using these, APIs and open source models as well. That means that we see huge amounts of interesting companies, interesting use cases. And the biggest takeaway that I have from all these conversations is actually the biggest problem in the industry right now is a product problem rather than a technical one. And what I mean by that is that it's really about how can you build something that delivers value to an end user. It's not really about how to build the thing, because that's very secondary to deciding what you're going to build and what's going to deliver value to the end user. If you think about any big successful company, like a Facebook or a Google or any of them, it's what actually made them successful is that they're delivering a really large amount of value to real people, and that's a product problem. Secondary to that is then how can you actually build the thing? And I think now there's some amazing foundational building blocks in the form of the GPT-4 APIs, the Claude API, all of these things. But actually the hardest thing, which we see in the ecosystem, is people figuring out how to apply that as part of a bigger comprehensive product, and actually turning that into something that delivers value to end users. And that's what we try and help people with, is understanding how their users are interacting with their products so they can get a sense of what they want, what they don't want, and then iterate towards product market fit. But it's not just the case that you can just throw a thin application on top of GPT-4 or any of the APIs and get like a great experience out of the box. Like there is going to need to be a lot of maybe putting a RAG system around it, putting like a great UI and a great product around it, so that you actually do deliver value for a person. Because a lot of these thin wrappers, what people are calling thin wrappers, they're also not actually delivering that much value. And so I think what you've got to do is work backwards and think, how can I solve a real problem for a real person, or how can I add real value to a real person, and then how can I build it, rather than thinking, okay, here's an API, I'm just going to put a front end in front of it.
And Mandela, I'm not sure with your startup, are you thinking of building your own models, or are you thinking of building on top of these models? And if so, if you are thinking about building on top of these models, how are you thinking about sort of adding value for your customers? And if you're thinking about building your own, why is that a decision that you're taking rather than building on top of them?
Yeah, so I think building your own models is a very, ambiguous term because it can mean quite a variety of different things. So there's one end of the spectrum where you're like building / retraining your own foundational models. And for maybe the 4 or 5 biggest companies in the world, that's like too expensive for most companies to even consider doing. And I don't even, I did a PhD in AI, like a lot of what these massive foundational models have is just like a lot of what we call like large scale pre-training. So like, to give you some sense, like during my PhD, there was 2 types of projects you could work on based on the access to resources you had. I was fortunate to spend most of my PhD at Meta, and so I had access to some of the largest computing resources available for a PhD student. And so I could train like these like foundational massive models on large amounts of data, let's say like millions of data points. While like if you were using sort of university resources, you just didn't have that level of compute. And so the problems you were focused on was sort of more fine-tuning problems. And so you have like these pre-trained models, and then you're applying it to different tasks or use cases that you're leveraging the massive amount of compute and money spent building these big models and then applying it to different use cases. And so I think what we're doing is something very similar at my company. We cannot afford to train a $100 million model to solve our task, but a lot of these companies like OpenAI, like Stability AI, have done all of this work for you. And as like a really good startup, your goal is how do you take these massive foundational models and figure out the fine-tuning use cases, the differentiated pipelines to provide value to your customers.
And Eito, if you could sort of jump in here, So when you are choosing, you've decided, okay, I'm not going to build my own, I'm going to choose a model. You basically are faced with this choice between choosing an open source model and a proprietary model. So what do you think? What do you think founders should consider when choosing between these models? You have a security company. Is open source safer for security or more of a risk? But also, what other considerations should be taken into account?
Yeah, I think one of the best concerns, I think in a more general advice is like, latency versus sort of like cost. One of the things that's really happening with, for example, the GPT APIs is like, the cost of inference is getting lower and lower, but the key there is that the latency is going up, right? And the reason why is because OpenAI in their sort of servers, they're just batching a lot of transaction requests, which obviously improves cost efficiency, but it really hurts the latency of your inference. And so like if you have a sort of latency sensitive application, then I really recommend that like, you probably stay off the APIs, especially because like that's sort of their incentive. Their incentive is to maximize the sort of cost efficiency of the API. So that's one reason to use like the open source models. There's also some stuff about, how the GPT is being nerfed because of RHF or something like that. I think in practice, I think the open source models aren't there yet. For us, luckily, latency isn't an issue, so we mostly experiment with just GPT-4. GPT-4 is undeniably still the best model, at least independent of context length. And so that's what we're using internally, but I think that there is a chance that these open source models and these platforms and startups which are trying to serve these open source models will improve dramatically. You're sort of seeing an incredible just improvement in performance and reduction in cost over even like the last 4 months.
And Lily, is open source versus proprietary something you would even consider, or are you just going to go, that's easy to deploy, I'm taking that route?
Yeah, it's a hard one because, so I didn't share, we love what we're building initially right now at Jack because it's a novel offering, it's a sperm test through the post, but what we're really trying to do is gather a huge amount of data about the patients. And so for the purpose of actually being able to understand what's driving the global decline in sperm count, as well as some of the major male fertility issues we're seeing across the world. So 1 in 6 couples will experience infertility at the moment, which is actually getting worse. And people sort of thinking about non-traditional family building as well. There are a lot of those issues don't go away. And so for us, we don't see a lot of public investment going into this. And so that's part of what we're really interested in is during the customer journey, we're getting a lot of information from the customers, as well as moving people more towards a consumer behavior of monitoring rather than reactively testing, saying, hey, we're actively trying to conceive, there's an issue. And then once we find out there's an issue, we just jump to maybe assisted reproductive technology rather than saying, hey, actually, sperm's a really good biomarker of health, and being able to monitor that. Sperm regenerates every 74 days. So 90 days later, if you make changes, you'll start seeing those results. And so for us, being able to develop a huge amount of data that could be integrated into much larger companies or into a person's basically health record, and being able to have a lot more autonomy and have larger inferences there, and being able to make better recommendations to people rather than saying like, hey, quit smoking. Oh, really? Like, no way. Being able to have more nuanced understanding of what's affecting people's overall health and moving more towards that holistic picture. And I think that's so much of like that preventative mindset. So to the actual implementation for us, budgetarily, we absolutely can't really build something at the moment, but we're trying to build sort of with an AI first mindset. And so being able to structure from day one all of our data in a way that we could then implement and then ultimately build this, we're a part of hopefully 23andMe, or if you're think of anyone that would enjoy working with us, let me know.
One other concern I think that we see with open source versus API-based models is data privacy. Like if you're trying to sell to a real enterprise, they're not going to be happy with you sending all their data to OpenAI or to Google or to anyone else. They need you to have an offering that can be self-hosted, and you can only self-host an open source model. So I think that is like the elephant in the room with this conversation. If you're trying to sell to any large enterprise, which is where all the revenue essentially lies, you're going to need a solution which can be self-hosted by the enterprise. I mean, especially if you're in the medical or medical adjacent field, then you're not going to be able to send all this patient data to OpenAI. It's not HIPAA compliant. You're going to need something which you can run locally on a HIPAA compliant machine, or that your bank customer or your insurance company customer or any of these large companies that aren't going to want to send all their user data to a third-party provider. And the only way to do that is an open source model.
I think there's a couple other considerations. One is at least so I think there's LLMs. I play more in the image space, so like Stable Diffusion, Midjourney, etc. Is one consideration around like copyright issues. I think Stability and Midjourney has sort of gotten a bunch of slack in that direction. Which I think in the LLM space is a little bit less problematic. And so that's like one consideration companies have is in terms of, do you own the data that you're training on because of like copyright reasons? And for example, Adobe has done some really awesome stuff with all the data that they train their Firefly model on is like licensed and owned by Adobe. Shutterstock recently had this new position where if you use their models and you're sued, they indemnify you. And so they're protecting you if you sort of, so they clearly used copyright stuff, but because they're protecting you, it's a bit safer, at least from a end user standpoint. And I think the other big consideration is cost, like sorry, not cost, but like access to GPUs. So like literally right now as a startup, you literally cannot access any GPU resources on the cloud, like Amazon, AWS, Google, GCP, Microsoft Azure. Like it's literally impossible to get GPU resources unless you have some Connect or you try to buy like large amounts of GPU resources. And so a lot of what we've thought about is how do you build these models that are extremely efficient and small on CPUs, and so you can sort of like use like CPU resources to like scale your system to handle like millions and millions of requests. And so there's a lot of different considerations which determine, hey, do you use open source, do you use an API? So yeah, it depends on like your use case.
And I think like data security and privacy is something you hear all the time from businesses that are thinking about implementing generative AI and the legal implications as well of that, how copyright might sort of affect them. But with open source models, I mean, we're seeing almost weekly a new open source model will come out and it seems to beat the benchmark of the previous one. And with that brings whole new challenges. If you've just built a product on top of one open source model, what do? Do you stick or twist and try out this new open source model at the potential expense of breaking what you've already made? And if it ain't broke, don't fix it, sort of thing. So I'd be interested to get, I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and sort of straight away.
I think the whole thing about sort of, benchmarks, it's quite a perverse game. That's what I would say. Like the analogy I would give to sort of like how the benchmark game works is like, you kind of have like these AI models studying before like a night, the exam tomorrow, and they're sort of like they just happen to have seen a lot of like the past papers maybe which were like very similar, and it just so happens that the test tomorrow was like just a small iteration on the original test. And so like these benchmarks are just not very well designed. Like there's no sort of separation between the original and the like output. I mean, there is to some degree, and so like I think we just have this huge problem with benchmarks right now where it's like, from a certain point of accuracy, like which one is better by how many percentages, it's really arbitrary and it doesn't really matter, and it's also just like application specific, and you're really seeing just proliferation of basically like the big popular models being the de facto anyway. Like, Llama 2 is probably the most notable recent one. There's obviously stuff like Vicuna and Falcon, but where I personally see it is people will just converge to a few models, which a lot of the right tooling is built for, and really some of these like other niche ones, unless they're sort of drastically better than the other models. I think the main popular ones will live out, and all the other ones will sort of be application specific in specific verticals, whether that be healthcare or whatever else. But they'll probably be fine-tuned anyway.
I think going off that point, so I think one thing that was brought up in the previous panel was sort of like, why is Meta open sourcing sort of like Llama and all of their models? And so one of the incredible things we're seeing is like the network effects of the open source community. And so what Meta benefits from is they release a model, there's so much innovation that happens on top of that model, on top of their architecture, and then they can directly use in production use cases. And so to Eito's point, like there a lot of I think at the startup you should focus on the model with the most like sort of activity behind it, the most resources behind it. So for example, like Facebook is probably going to keep improving Llama over time. One interesting thing that they did, and I think Stability AI is also doing, is they actually do not necessarily improve the architecture that much. They just improve the weights. And so to essentially use the updated version of their model, you just download new weights, which is just so much easier. And so I think Llama 2 is I think the exact same architecture as Llama 1, but with just like improved rates, better license, etc. And then to that just broader point is, I think the biggest bang for your buck is just fine-tuning the model, which is a weight update rather than an architectural. It's like a weight plus data update rather than an architectural update. And so that would be what I've seen.
Yeah, and OpenAI has their own fine-tuning service as well.
And if benchmarking is not that useful, Henry, perhaps for startups and founders building, they should actually look at the user experience. Maybe that's something that you can speak to.
Yes. That's too much jumped into it. But that kind of goes back to the point that I was making. That's like what's most important here is actually delivering value to an end user and having something that actually someone finds helpful. And so I think it's undeniable that the industry, the ecosystem, new models are being released incredibly rapidly with increasingly impressive performance. But you as a startup, like you don't want to kind of hook your cart to one specific horse. You probably want to be able to be flexible so that in 12 months' time when the landscape potentially shifts, then you can benefit from whatever the new state of the art is. And so what we facilitate is people testing lots of different models, lots of different prompts, lots of different experiment types, and then looking at how does this actually perform with real users, because that's the ultimate test. It doesn't really matter if this is scores 10 points higher on the exam, the benchmark. What matters is, do your users find it performs better? And so for that, you want to look at user performance signals, like what's the user input sentiment, what's the thumbs up, thumbs down rating, what are the conversion rates for conversion events that you define. And it really comes down to how do actual real people interact with your product when it's powered by this model versus that model. And you want to be able to swap different models out, different prompts, and a number of different variables as well. And so that's what we see as being most important at this very nascent stage of the ecosystem and the industry, is that you need to be able to be flexible and evolve. And that's kind of why we're building what we're building, to be this like cross-model, cross-provider analytics layer, so that you can try and experiment with lots of different options and then find what's the best for your specific vertical, your specific application.
I think one interesting point that you brought up is the concept of GitHub, when you think about like versioning system for code. So like one thing we do at our company is whenever we release a new app or a new product, we sort of like track, we do like the changes in this. Like, this is the change log from this version to that version. And so whenever you get like some change in metrics, so you have regressions, you have some pop-in numbers, you can sort of tie it to specific product changes that you make. One thing we're seeing in the age of like AI and LLMs is that the biggest driver of product engagement, product metrics is literally the model. And so being able to version control or track or understand where the like different changes you make on the model side impacts like product usage metrics is like so important. And so big shout out to the context.
and really, hypothetically speaking, if you were sort of making a decision on what model to use for, earlier you spoke about like trying to maybe choose something that would be more empathetic. would you be looking for what model is best to provide that feature of empathy, or is like consistency and reliability and almost being able to trust that model not to go off and do its own thing and hallucinate is actually more important to you?
Yeah, it's the latter. I mean,
Yeah.
perfectly teed up again. But I mean, for us, really, because it's health data and you're telling someone, it's really vulnerable, especially for people with sperm, to think about, there's so many big picture things that they're worried about when they get tested. And so we'd much rather make sure that any sort of inference that's happening or any time a patient is given data, like we can intervene as the team and the humans. And thankfully have a part of what's really fascinating about what we're building is just through the process of even recruiting people to get tested and building our algorithm and a lot of the different things that we're working on, we're getting a huge amount of data about a segment that's just not really known. Sort of people with sperm planning on having children or considering their sperm health. And so a lot of that, I think the quickest way is just a human brain with high EQ at the moment is my preferred model. But I would say, as that begins to compete, we'll have to, make those decisions. But for us, it's about like making sure that any result we get is correct, and everything else is sort of like another step of quality control, and we see that more in that piece because the empathy, I don't think there's a stronger competitor.
Sure, and I mean, there's so much debate around how dangerous is AI and how fast is it going to move, and these sort of questions. And what I personally think, and I'm putting my opinion out there, which I know you probably shouldn't do as a moderator, but I'm going to do it anyway, and maybe you can tear it down, is actually what might really be a great force for slowing down AI is that we need this sort of reliability and consistency, and the more ability you give an AI and the more freedom and autonomy you give it to go and act as an agent, the less reliable and consistent it becomes. So I don't know, Eito, if you have something, I know you've worked with sort of agents in the past, what you think about that. Is that a problem that will be overcome, or is the more intelligent you make something and more autonomous you make something, the more likely it is to go off and do less consistent things, and so the more risk it is to a business?
Yeah, I think it depends case by case. I mean, in our specific use case, we have our agents do very security-specific tasks, so it's sort of confined within this play box of like, hey, here's a program and hack it, right? That's kind of the thing. Like, we kind of want it to cause chaos. We kind of want an evil agent. So maybe for our specific use case, it's actually fine that it's dangerous. I think if it's customer facing, there's definitely quite a lot of risks associated there. There's a lot of sort of cybersecurity risks associated with it as well. Like there was some, I think OpenAI sort of brushed this off, but there was some like memory leakage issues where, for example, in the way they were sort of dealing with like chat memory, sometimes chat conversations from like one user would leak into someone else's. And so like, as the person who's like had it leaked into theirs, they can be like, what was I saying again? And then like, ChatGPT will just like reply with like, I don't know, some like deep dark secrets that they like the user was talking about above. Anyway, to go back into agents, I think it's definitely a bit of a dangerous thing, I think, to hook up agents to the internet. It's also like, if you're not careful, it can really sink your API costs. That's very nasty. But I think it's a moving target. I don't think we fully know the like full consequences of hooking it up. I think it's very application specific.
And in terms of building that sort of reliability and consistency, Henry, do you think it's important that you, as a company, you set up the systems and processes to be able to evaluate those sort of what's coming in?
Yeah, and look, I think to the agent point, I think when you're just making one request and you get one response back from the LLM, there's only like one jump for it to go wrong. So if it's 99% accurate, then it's going to be 99% correct. Whereas the issue with an agent is all of a sudden the agent decides what to do and then it completes 30 steps, and then all of a sudden your 99% accuracy, all of a sudden you've got like 0.99 to the 30th, which means the odds of the end result being correct are much, much lower. And so you're far more sensitive to the performance and the accuracy of the underlying model when you're stringing up an agent that does a whole bunch of consecutive calls back to itself. So that's where I think performance is actually most crucial, is the agentic use cases. And that's where probably you'll start to see the more and more demand, like pushing for better and better LLMs. But yeah, absolutely, that's where we see a lot of customers who are building using agents, that for them, there's incredible importance in monitoring, especially because we see plenty of people who like hook these things up in production, and all of a sudden they get burned and it emails like every single person in their contact list because it came up with some like far-fetched idea and they didn't put like approvals in place. And like these bad things are happening like right now, and they're not that bad because it's just like a bunch of embarrassing emails that go out. But it's really important to have like monitoring and kind of safety and human approval steps in there to stop it, going and doing some unintended consequences. And we're a small piece of that. We don't have the human approval steps. We're not really an agent platform or an analytics platform. So a lot of our customers are agent platforms, and it's very important for them that they have actions that come up that then a human has to approve. And I think there's interesting companies to be built there about having these kind of like permissions for your agent. Where it's like, I want you, agent, to do one thing, and if you do anything else, you need my explicit permission to do that. And putting those controls around something that's so ambiguous is going to be difficult, but I think there's a big opportunity there because I'm personally very bullish on agents.
Yeah. I mean, there are definitely like sort of secure, just very good like security best practices of just like, roles of like least privilege, just like giving the minimal amount of permissions. I think it is kind of scary how like, as you said, like I think the agents going wrong is definitely, there are some times where I feel like this is a precursor to the sort of AGI takeover, where it's sort of like, you say, hey, make me some paper clips, and the agent goes wrong, destroys the world. So yeah, anyway.
Yeah, I think one other interesting thing we're seeing on the agent side is just like how people find like different mechanisms to make the agents better. And so we've seen like some progress on the prompting side, where one of the top ways to prompt these models is called a chain of thought prompting or tree of thought prompting, where whenever an agent makes a decision, you ask the agent to be like, are you sure this is correct? And sort of like, yeah, I think there's been some interesting progress on the prompting side and different mechanisms to make these agents a bit more reliable. Yeah.
It's a very funny anecdote. I can't remember which research lab it was that said if you put like, take a deep breath, it increases accuracy.
That would be like one of the funniest parts about like this whole like LLM stuff. Is just like how much you have to just like pat these LLMs on the back, and it's like it's like you're a world expert in like X.
It's really unintuitive.
Yeah, no,
how these models behave. Like take a deep breath thing is just so bizarre.
Perfect. And so, what? I guess we have spoken quite a lot about the limitations of generative AI, but maybe we can sort of speak about some that you think maybe we haven't spoken about yet. I don't know if anyone has any ideas about limitations of generative AI that we actually haven't touched upon yet. Lily, do you have any that sort of jump to mind, or
No. Well, because I think it's often overwhelming to understand exactly all of the things that we've talked about. Like it does get quite, there are so many possibilities, and I think it's difficult, especially when you're in a nascent stage of a company or trying to find, again, everything from like product market fit if you're thinking about building a business. A lot of the stuff is just really interesting, and as a proud former philosophy major, I've gotten into a lot of really interesting discussions about like the ethical implications of what we're doing, and things that used to be just thought experiments and are all of a sudden like very possible, even the things we were just talking about now. So one, like, go philosophy, but really I think it's having these conversations and having an opportunity to go cross-disciplinary is incredibly important, and identifying those limitations in the various use cases, even when they don't seem relevant. Saying, so being able to chat through and say, from a technical side to commercial side, being able to have those like really like frequent conversations as well, because I think we rely a lot on social media and newsletters and all of that, and being able to actually just take it offline and say to folks, like, let's have a discussion, often removes a lot of that bias. So that would be my 2 cents.
Something I might jump in with is on the commercial side, I think things are very, very early. Yeah. On the technical side, things have just absolutely exploded and raced ahead so far. But actually, when you're trying to sell into larger enterprises, people are still, it's really early for them. Like they heard about ChatGPT, 6 months ago, 3 months ago, and it takes a very long time for them to build confidence in things, go through buying processes. And all the signs are that it's going to be a huge transformative shift, similar to like cloud or mobile for these big enterprises. But it's going to take them a long time to actually build the confidence and build up the kind of operations and the monitoring frameworks around this stuff that they're going to need in order to feel confident deploying it. I think there's been loads of research about this that I've been reading recently of CIOs and CTOs of like FTSE 500, S&P 500, FTSE 100 companies. And like these CIOs and these CTOs, they're incredibly bullish on the space. They think it's going to be transformative, but like almost none of them have actually got something in production yet. And so that means that for companies that are building these tools to support those kinds of efforts, it's still very early. And a lot of the technology which is being built isn't being deployed at massive scale outside of like a couple of small use cases like ChatGPT, obviously, and some entertainment use cases like Character.ai has like exploded in popularity. And I think they're the kind of two pillars where there's like tons and tons of success, but like enterprise business use cases, I think are a long way behind. And they're going to take some time for like the commercial products like to catch up with what the tech can do.
At least on my side, so I did a lot of my PhD on multimodal AI, and so how to essentially train systems that understand both the visual world, the oral world, as well as the textual world. And we're seeing quite a bit of progress there. Like OpenAI just released the GPT-4 vision model. I think just generally for AI to really be like fully mainstream, a lot of progress has to happen on the multimodal side. So it just hasn't, just being a text only layer or text only input model, I think is a limitation. But we're seeing a bunch of rapid progress. So like Lava 1.5 got released, GPT-4V got released, Adept AI just released their free model. And so yeah, a lot of exciting stuff. I think spend a lot of time in that space.
I think the main thing though will be sort of speed. I think like GPT Vision, I've been trying to use it for like the last week and a half or something like that. The main issue tends to be just like the inference time and just the speed at which it can actually like spit out useful outputs. And I think this is just a general concern for a lot of like, especially consumer facing like applications, where it's like if you have to wait 10 seconds for something to load, it's really not a great user experience. Maybe it's sort of similar to the early days of Instagram where, uploading images just took like 30 seconds. And so they had to make a lot of clever adjustments to fight around that.
Just to wrap up before we move to some questions, I actually asked ChatGPT earlier if it had any questions for you, and it came up with quite a creepy question. Here we go.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Will you let me autonomously make some business decisions? So one word. Can you see yourself ever handing over some autonomous business decisions to AI?
So I'll take the controversial yes, because the business decision is not defined, it could be very small, right? So if it's like try a new format of this already 20 format ad campaign, why not?
Sure.
I'd say yes. It really depends. I think it would take a bit of getting used to, where it's like I would have to like initially verify the decisions. But we're trying to sort of automate ourselves away as much as possible so that we can focus on the most important things.
On that point, I think a lot of like my role as a CEO is honestly a lot of like people management, emotional management, and so at least on that part, I don't think ChatGPT is quite there.
Yeah. You stole my answer.
Yeah.
Precisely that, I'm like, then I'm out of a job.
Yeah.
No, but I think it is, but it also, to that point, if I was monitoring the performance and I ultimately gained enough confidence, who am I to say actually I have a bias against it just because it's an AI? But I would need to have that level of confidence, and I would be able to say, look, you're one of you thinking you, right? Even interestingly using that term, but saying this agent is one of my best employees, so I am going to let it do it. But yeah, I think that's
actually,
where it's really.
It's very good at writing hard emails.
Oh yeah.
Delivering bad news. It's great. You always feel horrible writing it. You kind of get pauses, but you can just get it to write it for you, and then you modify it a little bit.
Sounds like an AI HR department is brewing. So with that, any questions from the audience? Do we need to have the mic? Good. Yeah. Just in the front left here. Yeah.
Please hold it.
Thank you. My name is Andrew Gall. Companies implementing tech and how it changes business models. So great perspectives from all of you around using open systems or getting the product right. My question really is about data and the power and the startups who capture that data. Where do you think that is going to be really important in this use of AI? I think it will be, but just interesting on people's perspective on the data and power of data for building your businesses.
So I have some. So at least what we're seeing, and then so the whole. So at least when I was in my PhD, the whole paradigm shifted in terms of this concept of pre-training, and so this is what all of these foundational models do, is that they learn this world model on a lot of data, like millions and billions of data points, and then you would then use that model for like different use cases. And for like those different use cases, before you'd have to have like a lot of data for each use case. But with pre-training, you just need much less data for each use case for the model to perform well. And so I think what this paradigm shift has happened with like the pre-training fine-tuning paradigm is just less data for these models to do well at different tasks. And so I think high quality data is important for each use case, but the quality doesn't matter as much.
I would maybe piggyback on that as well and say, I think it depends what layer of the stack you're looking at. Like if you're trying to build the next best, the next great LLM, obviously having like a massive data set that competes with Google or OpenAI is very important. But if you're trying to build something at the application layer, then actually getting all this real user data is very important so that you can shape the product. Kind of to the points I was making earlier about having user feedback that lets you then iterate your product to make your product better. So it depends whether you're talking about like the model layer where data is of perhaps decreasing value compared to years past, or like the application layer where data is still incredibly valuable, just like data is valuable to YouTube or Instagram today.
Precisely the same thing. I think that's where the data, it's really critical to have something proprietary that you understand as well. Like I think there are a lot of cases where people just think the more data, the better. But I think really being targeted in what data you're collecting and what those inferences are and really knowing your data set is going to be what sets a lot of products apart.
Yeah, like Facebook has released like 2 recent papers which have been extremely fascinating. One in the LLM space and then one in the text-to-image space. And they basically showed that after pre-training a model with just 1,000 images for like a text-to-image model and just 1,000 like labeled examples on the like LLM space, they're able to get like just as good performance as some of these other bigger models by just like how well they curated this high quality data set. And so I think quality seems to be the new like benchmark of data rather than quantity, at least after the large pre-training step.
And you can see it in sort of like the lawsuits or where sort of Reddit, Quora, Pinterest and a few others sort of like sued these AI companies for basically like using their data because they know the value of their data, which is like, it's that sort of very special touch that these individual data sets have. And so I think the most important thing for businesses to maybe think about is like, how do you build a data ingestion pipeline coming from real users and like really keeping that in-house and not letting it out?
At least on that point, I think what's been interesting is that, and so a lot of these companies like say Reddit, say Quora, Pinterest, they've built a lot of their massive growth and acquisition engine from SEO. And so a big part of SEO is exposing your data for people, for indexes, for search engines to index and for people to discover when they search. And so we're seeing this like sort of like cross correction where it's like, oh, actually I didn't want to do that now. And so like even like X now, you can't actually like click on like a Twitter link without logging in now because of a lot of these reasons actually. So it's been fascinating because I'm also from a growth background, and so I built a lot of stuff on the SEO side, and so seeing how that has sort of course-corrected.
We're back to the walled garden.
Yeah, exactly.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes, just here on the third row.
Thank you all for the inspiring talk. So there's lots of open source code these days, and I want to ask how to create your differentiality as a startup to thrive in the market, and to compete with like big companies.
Yeah, the thing that I see, and it comes back to the kind of the product rather than the technical point, is it really comes down to identifying an opportunity to add value to real people. Whether it's a problem which isn't yet solved for some large group of people, maybe it's an opportunity to make their life better in some way. It really comes down to having that business and that human opportunity to help people. And once you've identified that, then it's all downstream and how much you're going to solve the problem. But I think the hardest thing, which is what has always been the hardest thing starting a business 5 years ago or 50 years ago, is like, where is there an unmet need in society that I can go and solve and capture value from? And the open source or closed source debate is very much, I think, downstream of finding a real opportunity and then like penciling out what a solution would look like. And it's only then that you need to figure out how to build it. So I would say it really comes down to like identifying the opportunity to help someone.
I find I'll maybe take like the opposite end, which is like, I think you actually want to look at the incumbents and think, what incentive structures drive them? And how does that incentive structure determine what they can do and can't do? In the sense that they will definitely not build products which cannibalize on their own existing businesses. And so that's sort of where the sort of Achilles heel is at on these big incumbents. And so I think that's where startups are usually uniquely positioned to fight against the incumbents.
And yeah, I think like at least how we think about just like product in general is that there are different ways to build moats outside of just technology. There's obviously distribution, there's network effects, there is brand. So I think that like I think technology is obviously very important, but there's other key important parts of a business that you need to be successful.
Absolutely, yeah. I did my MBA here at Oxford at Said, and that's how I met my co-founder. We were in the same study group, like day one, got to know him as a friend, and then he and his wife had their first baby on the first day of lockdown. So I had to, like completely, it was so brutal. Like I thought my situation was bad. And all of a sudden, so they had to have this infant lockdown, very little support. And as they started thinking about trying for their second, he looked at the options available in fertility, and it's one of the only times where everything is directed at the female consumer. And so even then, I, as a massive feminist, went to an all-women's undergrad. I was like, oh my gosh, that's crazy, because it's putting all the burden on the female partner. It's equally likely to be male or female factor in infertility. And so that was really how we identified it, was that we're like, that's really odd. And then we spent literally 6 months talking ourselves out of doing the business, because we were like, surely this has been thought of before. Said all sorts of things, unsavory things that were like, I'm sure there's a reason why, and we never found a good enough reason. And so for us, I mean, part of it, we just built the product that we think that consumers wanted. For us, it was a lot of like, people needed a discrete solution. We did tons of customer interviews. We basically mapped the whole stakeholder ecosystem, talked to multiple of each type of stakeholder, and then said, like, what is the consumer actual pain point? And then we built the technology to fit that. And using a variety of different methods, a lot of different advisors, but that would be my advice, is really thinking about precisely, as we were all saying, like, find the problem and then solve the solution. And that's what's amazing about doing this in 2023, scarily soon 2024, is that you do have so much faster and so much easier to iterate as well. Because I think we often start going down a garden path and then we're like, actually, no, we want to build this. The consumer doesn't necessarily want this, and trying to like stop that bias in our development process.
Anyone else with a question? Just there in the middle.
Eito, you mentioned an assistant product at the start. You said the name, that it beats Copilot, but I missed it. So could you just share it again?
Yeah, it's cursor.sh.
Cursor.sh, thank you.
It is unbelievably useful. I don't use GitHub. I don't use VS Code anymore.
Any more questions? Maybe?
Thanks for asking that.
just this one is here.
Thank you very much for this really interesting panel. My question comes from an observation made by Mandela about Shutterstock providing an indemnity if you get sued by copyright, which led me to think about the insurance market in this space. Is there an insurance market in this space yet? Is it potentially a solution for startups, or would the premiums just be so prohibitive that actually it doesn't make your lives better in terms of allocating risk, or at least mitigating risk in the event that it comes your way? Thank you.
I can just jump in and say my pre-MBA career was first in big law and global M&A, and then in banking. So of course, my co-founder is also from big corporate, so we are way too corporate about everything we do. And so precisely that, we immediately looked into what are the sort of insurance risks and was there a product. I think at least in the UK, the market is iterating quite quickly. They have products, but they don't necessarily offer like you could pay for coverage, but it's not necessarily a risk that has been considered, and they seem to really be like, there are certain products that we haven't purchased, frankly, because we're like, it doesn't seem like they're actually going to cover anything useful. And then there's a reputational risk for them that I think they're trying to say, we're thinking about it, but we don't really want to commit, because obviously, as in terms of the insurance product itself, that's really risky for them, but also for the individuals, where like you clearly don't understand the technology to be able to insure it in a lot of cases. So I've seen personally a really broad range. In addition, that's more for the tech side of things for us, because we're obviously a medical device, so we're thinking a lot about that context, but precisely to maybe like a larger application, I'd be very curious to hear about y'all if you have sort of that in your corporate stack.
I've seen people marketing like AI insurance, but I think the place where I see like an insurance product have more like actual adoption is where you've got like Microsoft indemnifying people and Adobe indemnifying people that are using their generative AI services. So that's the only place that I've actually seen it be like successful. But I was at some event where one of the sponsors was trying to sell like an AI insurance product, but over in the US rather than here.
Yeah, we haven't seen an AI insurance product, but at least we talk very closely with our lawyers, and the kind of consensus right now is that there's a bunch of cases, one against OpenAI and then one against Stability AI, and so the impact of those results is probably going to affect the entire business landscape significantly, depending on and so yeah, it's a moving target. Like, I think the best that you could do right now is just like build and ship as fast as possible, and
move fast and break.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's definitely a very, very turbulent time on the law IP side and copyright for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Just front right here, second row.
Thanks. So assuming a lot of us are founders, if each of you had one very quick top tip, like a link or a platform or a tool or even just a piece of advice you think is like maybe the most important thing to share for another founder, what would that be?
I'd say move quickly. Like, I don't think anything beats like iterating fast and time to market and closing that loop of getting something out there, learning from a real user. I see people that are at startups that have taken like 2 years to get something out, and it just blows my mind. It's like we had a product out there by like week 1, and then you can iterate and learn so much more quickly.
Yeah, adding on to that, I think sitting in asymmetric information flows has been one of the most helpful things. So sort of like figuring out where there are sort of information that not many participants of the market are listening to, and just placing yourself in, I think, asymmetric information flows is exponentially easier than trying to be smarter than everyone else.
For me, pick your co-founder wisely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think like, as in, one, doing it by yourself is very hard. It's a very intense, long, difficult process. And then, particularly in picking a co-founder, I think I have a couple pieces of advice there. One is make sure that person has like very similar, both short, medium, and long-term goals as you. I think a lot of co-founder conflicts and co-founder issues happen when people just have like different goals, and with different goals, it's just very hard to align and sort of solve a particular problem. So that's one. And then I think the other thing is like clearly define the responsibilities among co-founders. I think a lot of conflicts happen when some key responsibility is shared among two people, and then it is hard to build consensus with different opinions if there isn't someone who is directly responsible for this specific thing.
It's basically a marriage.
Yeah, it is.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say that you should definitely remember to invest in relationships and develop a good, even really baseline CRM, and think about like all of your stakeholders within that, not just customers, but thinking about investors, ecosystems, all of that. And very closely tied to that, ask for help. We initially started out, we're like, oh, we're in stealth. We don't want anyone to know what we're doing. And we're like, we'll be in stealth forever if we do that. And we'll just be sitting here like, it's the classic, it's the same thing, like sort of trying to develop it by yourself is that, you move so much further when you go together. And so that's been a major learning for me that I'll carry through whatever I do.
And was there a question in the front row?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very technical one, but...
Yeah.
Okay, so there's a new technology, a new language called pseudo-lang. Have you come across this? I'm particularly focusing on YouTube. So it's a very interesting way of kind of briefing AIs. Worth checking out. So if you haven't heard of it, then you can't possibly answer. But it's kind of, it makes so much sense because it puts constraints into the way you brief the AI. And so it's taking a lot of the learnings that we've had through prompt engineering over the last year or so and applying them in a very structured way. And I was interested to, you obviously haven't used it, but I'm only experimenting with it. But I'm already starting to see some very interesting results. Does it make sense that that might be the case? It's introducing structures like if loops and written as pseudocode.
Actually, there are lots of products like this. So there's like LMQL, which allows you to write like sort of SQL-esque queries for like LLMs. There's like regex LLM, which you can like specify the regex for the output. There's I think like CFG LLM, and yeah, this is a like very active area of research, I think. And people have made very smart contributions about it. We can talk about it after the talk.
Yeah.
Is it a language for prompting?
It is a language for prompting, and the guy who's developed it. It's open, so it's on GitHub. The guy who's developed it has kind of written examples to train GPT to train you, so you learn using GPT. So that's the first thing you do is it loads the syntax. It's very, very clever.
Yeah, I think one thing we've seen, and it's kind of similar to like each model is kind of like its own programming language, where the syntax that works for GPT-4 is very different to the syntax that works for Llama 2 and very different to the syntax that works for, let's say, like Vicuña. So I think, at least what we've seen, at least in the image, the text to image space, is like how you prompt one model is just very different to how you prompt the other model. And I think how you build structures and these prompting languages that works across a variety of different model use cases and different models, I think would be very important.
So it makes logical sense that it would be a good thing to dig deep in. Yeah. Okay.
And with that, that's the end of this panel. It's time for lunch. Lunch is up next, which has made it really easy. I don't have to remember the name of the talk that was on after me. So yeah, I think it's time for some food, and I hope you enjoyed it. Well done.